A 72-year-old retired emergency room nurse lay pinned against the cold, unforgiving concrete of her own driveway. Her frail wrists were violently twisted behind her back by two sneering patrol officers. Red and blue lights strobed across the quiet suburban street, shattering the peace of an otherwise ordinary Sunday evening. They thought she was a nobody. They assumed she was just another easy target, a confused trespasser in an affluent neighborhood where they believed she didn't belong. But as the sickening metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the crisp autumn air, a sleek, unmarked black Suburban violently hopped the curb, tires screeching in protest. Out stepped a towering man in a sharply tailored suit, his golden FBI badge catching the strobing lights. He wasn't just a high-ranking federal agent. He was their son, and absolute hell was about to rain down on the officers who crossed the line. Elara Kingston possessed the kind of quiet, unshakable dignity that could only be forged through 4 decades of working the trauma ward at Mercy General Hospital. At 72, her hands were gnarled by severe arthritis, the knuckles swollen and stiff. Yet they moved with a practiced, loving gentleness as she pruned the vibrant heirloom rose bushes lining the front porch of 442 Sycamore Lane. This house, a beautiful 2-story colonial wrapped in ivory siding and forest green shutters, had been her sanctuary for over 35 years. She and her late husband, Harlan, had purchased the property when the neighborhood of Oak Ridge was just beginning to expand, working extra shifts and saving every spare dime to provide a safe, idyllic haven for their only child. Oak Ridge had changed over the decades. The modest, middle-class families had slowly moved out, replaced by a wave of affluent, gated, community-minded professionals who built massive privacy fences and rarely spoke to their neighbors. Elara, however, remained a fixture. She was the woman who left fresh-baked peach cobbler on new arrivals' doorsteps, even if those containers were rarely returned. She knew the history of the soil she knelt on, and she loved her home with a fierce, protective pride. Sunday afternoons were sacred. Sunday meant a slow morning of reflection, tending to her beloved garden and preparing a massive, slow-cooked pot roast for her son, who visited without fail every single week. She wore a faded, oversized gardening hat that obscured her face from a distance, a worn canvas apron over a comfortable floral blouse, and heavy-duty gardening gloves. To anyone who actually knew her, she was the matriarch of Sycamore Lane. To the new couple who had just moved into the massive, hyper-modern monstrosity of a house across the street, a couple who had never bothered to introduce themselves, she was an anomaly. Sweat beaded on Elara's forehead as she clipped a particularly stubborn, thorny stem. She hummed a low, soulful gospel tune, her mind entirely focused on the intricate root system of a dying crimson rose. She was entirely oblivious to the paranoid eyes tracking her from across the asphalt, and she certainly didn't hear the frantic, hushed phone call being placed to the local precinct. Yes, dispatch. There is a suspicious individual prowling around the property at 442 Sycamore. She's looking in the bushes, casing the windows. She doesn't belong here. Please send someone immediately. 15 minutes later, the heavy, rumbling engine of a local police cruiser shattered the suburban silence. The vehicle, stark white with bold blue lettering, rolled aggressively down the street, braking sharply right behind Elara's parked sedan. Officer Blaine Hargrove sat behind the wheel. Hargrove was a man whose entire personality was built around his badge, a heavy-set, red-faced patrolman with a notoriously short temper and a deeply ingrained superiority complex. He had spent the last 8 years treating the citizens of the county less like a community to protect and more like subjects to control. His partner, Officer Declan Voss, was younger, nervous, and strictly followed Hargrove's lead, desperate to prove he belonged in the brotherhood of the uniform. Hargrove cut the engine and stepped out, adjusting his heavy-duty belt with a practiced swagger. He didn't see a homeowner. He saw a profile that fit his own internal biases. An older, unkempt-looking black woman wearing baggy work clothes, lingering near the windows of an expensive house in a wealthy, predominantly white subdivision. "Hey, you there!" Hargrove barked, his voice echoing loudly off the quiet houses. Elara, startled, dropped her pruning shears. They clattered loudly against the stone walkway. She turned, squinting through the afternoon sun, pushing her wide-brimmed hat up slightly. Her knees popped as she slowly, painfully stood up, wiping a streak of topsoil from her cheek. "Can I help you, officers?" she asked, her voice calm but understandably confused. She instinctively took a step forward, wanting to bridge the distance to hear them better over the wind. "Stop right there! Don't take another step!" Hargrove yelled, his hand instantly hovering over the grip of his service weapon. Voss mirrored the movement, looking tense and jittery. Elara froze, her eyes widening behind her wire-rimmed glasses. "Excuse me, I'm just tending to my garden. Is there a problem?" "We got a call about a prowler casing the property," Hargrove said, closing the distance rapidly, invading her personal space. He looked her up and down with blatant disgust. "Whose house is this? Who do you work for?" "Work for?" Elara let out a short, incredulous breath. "Officer, I don't work for anyone. I am retired. This is my home. I've lived here for 35 years. Hargrove let out a harsh, patronizing laugh. "Yeah, sure you have. Let me guess. You just forgot your keys, right? Let's see some identification now." "My purse is inside," Elara explained, her voice remarkably steady despite the sudden shocking hostility. As a former ER nurse, she was used to de-escalating irrational people. But she had never expected to employ those tactics on her own front lawn against sworn protectors of the law. "I have my gardening clothes on. My ID is in my wallet on the kitchen counter. If you'll allow me to go inside, I will happily show you my driver's license, my utility bills, and the deed to this house." "You aren't going anywhere near that house," Hargrove snapped, stepping so close that Elara could smell the stale coffee and aggressive spearmint gum on his breath. "You're going to turn around, place your hands flat against the siding, and spread your feet." "Officer, this is ridiculous," Elara said, her tone firming up. She was not a woman who cowed easily. "You are making a terrible mistake. My name is Elara Kingston. You can radio your dispatch and look up the property records right now. It takes 2 minutes." Hargrove's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He despised being told how to do his job, especially by someone he had already mentally categorized as a suspect. In his mind, her eloquence and refusal to immediately submit to his unreasonable demands were signs of defiance, not the reasonable responses of an innocent homeowner. "I am giving you a lawful order," Hargrove roared, the vein in his neck bulging. "Turn around right now." The air on Sycamore Lane seemed to thicken, the ambient chirping of birds entirely silenced by the sudden violent tension. Elara Kingston stood her ground, though her heart had begun to hammer violently against her ribs. She was acutely aware of her physical vulnerability. Her arthritis made quick movements impossible, and her recent hip replacement meant a fall could be catastrophic. "Officer, please listen to me," Elara pleaded, raising her dirt-stained hands in a gesture of absolute surrender. "I am perfectly willing to cooperate, but I am an old woman, and I cannot easily bend to be searched. Let me call my son. He's on his way here right now. He can clear all of this up." The mention of her calling someone triggered something dark and volatile in Officer Hargrove. He saw a loss of control, a challenge to his absolute authority. "Voss, secure her," Hargrove ordered. Before Elara could process the command, Hargrove lunged forward. He didn't wait for his partner. He grabbed Elara's left arm, his thick, meaty fingers digging ruthlessly into the fragile skin of her bicep. He yanked her forward with shocking, disproportionate force. Elara cried out, a sharp gasp of pure agony escaping her lips as her arthritic shoulder was wrenched far past its natural range of motion. "Stop! You're hurting me." "Stop resisting," Hargrove bellowed, a phrase he used automatically, a verbal shield designed for body cameras and witness testimonies, completely detached from the reality of the situation. Elara wasn't resisting. She was collapsing under his brute strength. Hargrove shoved her violently against the rough brick exterior of the house. The impact knocked the breath from Elara's lungs. Her wire-rimmed glasses flew off her face, shattering against the concrete driveway. Her wide-brimmed hat fell, exposing the terrified, pained expression of a grandmother being treated like a hardened felon. Across the street, the heavy curtains of the hyper-modern house twitched. The new neighbors were watching, cell phones lightly in hand, recording the spectacle they had initiated, completely insulated from the physical devastation occurring just yards away. Officer Voss, looking visibly pale and out of his depth, rushed up to assist. Instead of stopping his partner, the young officer's training failed him. He succumbed to the momentum of the chaos, grabbing Elara's other arm. "Bring it behind her back, Voss," Hargrove grunted, using his full body weight to pin the 72-year-old woman against the brick. "Please," Elara sobbed, the pain in her joints blinding her. Tears carved tracks through the garden dirt on her cheeks. "My hip. I had surgery on my hip. I can't twist like this. You are breaking my arm." "Should have thought about that before you decided to burglarize a neighborhood out of your league," Hargrove sneered right into her ear. With a savage upward jerk, he forced her right wrist up toward her shoulder blades. The sound that followed was a sickening pop. Elara let out a harrowing, agonizing scream that echoed down the entire block. Her legs gave out completely. She slumped downward, but the officers held her suspended by her violently twisted arms. The excruciating pain of a dislocated shoulder radiated through her entire body, sending her into a state of shock. "Get the cuffs on her," Hargrove barked, completely devoid of empathy, seemingly energized by the dominance he was asserting. Voss fumbled with his belt, pulling out the heavy steel handcuffs. His hands were shaking. Even he realized this had gone too far, but fear of his commanding officer kept his mouth shut. He clicked the cold metal tightly around Elara's wrists, ratcheting them down until they dug deep into her fragile skin, cutting off circulation. They dragged her away from the wall and carelessly threw her down onto the concrete driveway. Elara landed hard on her side, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The rough pavement scraped against her cheek, drawing a trickle of blood that mingled with her tears. She lay there, a proud, deeply loved woman reduced to a heap of pain and humiliation in the driveway she had swept for 3 decades. "Stay down!" Hargrove shouted, unnecessarily pointing a finger at the incapacitated, handcuffed elderly woman. He pulled out his radio, his chest puffed out with the arrogant satisfaction of a man who believed he had just taken down a dangerous criminal. "Dispatch. This is Unit 4. Suspect is detained. Requesting a transport unit to 442 Sycamore." Elara squeezed her eyes shut, praying for her son. She prayed he would arrive. She prayed he wouldn't be too late. The world around her was spinning into a dark, painful blur. She felt cold, the shock setting in rapidly. Hargrove paced back and forth, entirely unbothered by the whimpering woman at his feet. "Thought you could talk your way out of it, huh?" he mocked. "People like you always think you can play the victim. Not on my watch." Voss stood a few feet away, shifting his weight uncomfortably, avoiding looking at Elara. He stared down the street, hoping the transport van would arrive quickly so he could wash his hands of the sickening feeling pooling in his gut. Instead of a white police transport van, what Voss saw tearing around the corner of Sycamore Lane made his blood run cold. Supervisory Special Agent Vaughn Kingston was having a rare, exceptionally good day. The morning had brought news that a 2-year grueling undercover operation he had orchestrated out of the Detroit field office had finally culminated in the successful indictment of a massive multi-state human trafficking ring. The paperwork was filed, the perpetrators were behind bars, and for the first time in months, the heavy, crushing weight of his job had momentarily lifted. At 45, Vaughn was an intimidating, deeply respected figure within the Bureau. Standing 6 feet 3 inches with shoulders built like a linebacker and a sharp, calculating intellect, he commanded absolute authority whenever he walked into a room. He wore his tailored charcoal suit like armor, but underneath the hard, pragmatic exterior of a seasoned federal agent beat the heart of a fiercely devoted son. Sunday dinners at his mother's house were his anchor. They were the one constant in a life defined by violence, deception, and the darkest corners of human nature. As he navigated his sleek, government-issued black Suburban through the familiar tree-lined streets of Oak Ridge, he could already smell the phantom scent of Elara's famous pot roast. He was smiling, a rare, genuine expression as he turned the final corner onto Sycamore Lane. The smile died instantly. A heavy blanket of dread slammed into Vaughn's chest. Half a block away, parked haphazardly in front of his childhood home, was a local police cruiser, its light bar spinning violently, casting harsh red and blue shadows across the manicured lawns. His trained eyes instantly scanned the scene. He didn't see broken windows or a damaged vehicle. He saw 2 uniformed officers standing in the driveway. And then his vision narrowed to a horrifying microscopic point. Lying on the harsh concrete, handcuffed, bleeding and trembling, was a woman in a floral gardening blouse. Vaughn didn't gently press the brakes. He slammed his custom Oxford shoe down on the accelerator. The heavy Suburban surged forward with a deafening, aggressive roar. Inside the vehicle, Vaughn's mind went terrifyingly quiet. The protective, loving son and the highly trained tactical agent merged into one singular, devastating force. He recognized the hat on the ground. He recognized the apron. Mom. Officer Voss heard the roar of the engine and turned. His eyes widened in absolute terror as the massive black SUV, sporting heavily tinted windows and government plates, barreled towards them. It didn't stop in the street. Vaughn cranked the steering wheel hard. The heavy vehicle hopped the curb with a violent crunch, the suspension protesting as it tore across the edge of the pristine lawn, skidding to a brutal, precise halt mere feet from where Officer Hargrove was standing over Elara. Dust and gravel sprayed across the officer's legs. Before the Suburban had even fully rocked back on its shocks, the driver's side door flew open. Vaughn Kingston erupted from the vehicle. He didn't run. He moved with the terrifying controlled speed of an apex predator. His suit jacket flew open, revealing the unmistakable black grip of his Glock 19 holstered at his hip and the heavy gold FBI shield clipped securely to his belt. "Hey, back in your vehicle." Hargrove shouted, instinctively reaching for his sidearm, completely misjudging the man he was addressing. This is an active... Hands off your weapon. Vaughn's voice didn't just boom. It possessed a concussive, authoritative force that seemed to rattle the windows of the nearby houses. It was the voice of a man accustomed to screaming down armed cartel sicarios. Hargrove froze, momentarily paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming presence of the man charging at him. Voss took 3 rapid steps backward, his hands held up in a placating gesture. Vaughn didn't look at the officers. He dropped immediately to his knees on the rough concrete beside Elara. His massive hands, which had taken down hardened killers, hovered gently, trembling slightly as he assessed the brutal damage. "Mom," Vaughn whispered, his voice cracking, the hard federal agent entirely stripped away. "Mom, it's Vaughn. I'm here." Elara weakly turned her head. Her face was scraped raw, dirt packed into a bleeding cut on her cheek. Her breathing was dangerously shallow, her eyes glassy with shock and agony. "Vaughn," she gasped, a tear leaking from the corner of her eye. "My shoulder, baby. It's broken. They broke it." A cold, absolute fury settled over Vaughn Kingston. It wasn't a hot, reckless anger. It was an icy, calculating wrath. He looked closely at the handcuffs biting into her swollen, arthritic wrists. He saw the unnatural, horrifying angle of her left shoulder. He stood up slowly. The transformation was terrifying to watch. The tender son vanished, replaced entirely by a predatory federal authority. He turned to face Officer Hargrove, his eyes completely dead of any warmth or mercy. "What is your name?" Vaughn asked. The volume was low, but the tone promised absolute destruction. Hargrove puffed out his chest, trying to maintain his bravado, though a bead of sweat now traced down his temple. "I don't have to tell you anything, pal. Who the hell do you think you are? She's a suspect in a residential burglary." Vaughn didn't blink. He closed the distance between himself and Hargrove in 2 strides, stopping inches from the patrolman's face. He didn't shout. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply reached out, his hand moving like a striking viper, and snatched the microphone attached to Hargrove's radio lapel. "Dispatch, this is FBI Supervisory Special Agent Vaughn Kingston. Badge number 44,789 Delta." Vaughn spoke clearly into the mic, his eyes burning holes into Hargrove's panicked face. "I am declaring a federal emergency on scene at 442 Sycamore Lane. I need an EMT unit expedited here immediately for a critically injured elderly female. And I need your watch commander here in exactly 5 minutes, or I am mobilizing a federal tactical team to arrest 2 of your officers for civil rights violations and aggravated assault." He released the microphone, letting it snap back against Hargrove's chest. "She is a suspect in a burglary." Vaughn's voice was a venomous hiss. He pointed a rigid finger at the front door of the house. "That is my mother. She has owned this house for 35 years, and you just signed your own professional death warrant." Silence descended upon the front lawn of 442 Sycamore Lane, broken only by the ragged, painful breathing of an elderly woman and the static crackle of a police radio. Supervisory Special Agent Vaughn Kingston did not break eye contact with Officer Blaine Hargrove. The local patrolman's aggressive swagger had entirely evaporated, replaced by a sickening, cold realization that he had just stepped into a trap of his own making. "Take the cuffs off her," Vaughn commanded. It was not a request. It was an absolute directive issued by a man who held the full weight of the United States Department of Justice behind him. Hargrove swallowed hard, his face drained of color. "Agent Kingston, procedure dictates that until a supervisor..." If you do not remove those steel restraints from my mother's broken body in the next 3 seconds, Vaughn interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, I will charge you with felony assault under color of law right here on this concrete. I will personally place you in federal custody. 1, 2. Officer Declan Voss moved before Hargrove could process the threat, panic overriding his deference to his senior partner. The younger officer scrambled forward, his hands trembling so violently he dropped his keys twice. I got it. I'm doing it, Voss stammered, his voice cracking. He practically fell to his knees beside Elara, desperately trying to steady his hands to unlock the heavy metal ratchets. As the jaws of the handcuffs finally clicked open, Elara let out a gut-wrenching sob. Her arms fell limply to her sides. Vaughn immediately pushed Voss out of the way, kneeling in the dirt and gravel to support his mother's head. He didn't care about his custom-tailored suit or the expensive wool of his trousers tearing against the pavement. He carefully supported her uninjured right side, shielding her from the harsh autumn wind. I've got you, Mom. You're safe now, Vaughn murmured, pressing a kiss to her dusty forehead. The ambulance is coming. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing exponentially louder. But it wasn't just the paramedics. 2 heavy, unmarked SUVs and a local police supervisor's vehicle came tearing around the corner, their lights blinding in the fading afternoon sun. Captain Harlan Finch, the precinct's watch commander, stepped out of his vehicle. Finch was a 20-year veteran, a pragmatic man who instantly recognized that a situation had gone nuclear when he saw a black, federal Suburban parked aggressively on the lawn and an FBI agent kneeling over an injured civilian. What in God's name is going on here? Captain Finch barked, marching up the driveway. He looked at Hargrove, who was standing completely rigid, sweating profusely. Hargrove, report. Vaughn stood up, his towering frame blocking Finch from getting any closer to Elara. He reached into his breast pocket and produced his leather credentials case, flipping it open to display his badge and photo ID. Supervisory Special Agent Vaughn Kingston, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Vaughn stated, his tone freezing the air between them. Captain Finch, your men responded to a profiling call made by a neighbor. Without establishing identity, without provocation, and without a shred of probable cause, they violently assaulted a 72-year-old homeowner. They dislocated her shoulder, lacerated her face, and handcuffed her while she was gardening on her own property. Finch blanched. He looked down at the shattered wire-rimmed glasses, the dropped pruning shears, and the weeping elderly woman. He recognized Elara. She had organized the annual neighborhood watch bake sale for years. A heavy pit of dread settled in the captain's stomach. Agent Kingston, I am incredibly sorry, Finch started, turning a furious glare toward Hargrove and Voss. We will handle this internally. I will take their statements. You won't be handling anything internally, Captain. Vaughn cut him off with surgical precision. As of 3 minutes ago, this is an active federal civil rights investigation. Your officers' body cameras, the dash cam footage from their cruiser, and the dispatch logs are now federal evidence. If either of these men touches their recording equipment, I will add destruction of evidence to their federal indictment. The paramedics, led by a seasoned EMT named Lydia Thorne, rushed up the driveway with a stretcher and a trauma kit. Vaughn stepped back, his eyes softening only for the medical professionals. She has a severe dislocation of the left shoulder, possible fractures, and she's a recent hip replacement patient, Vaughn informed Lydia rapidly, speaking in crisp, clinical terms. She is in profound shock. As Lydia and her partner carefully stabilized Elara's arm, administering a rapid dose of pain medication, Captain Finch turned his wrath onto his own men. Hargrove, Voss, strip your duty belts now, Finch ordered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. You are stripped of your police powers pending a full criminal inquiry. Get in the back of my cruiser. Hargrove's jaw set stubbornly. Captain, she fit the description of a prowler. We were doing our jobs. This guy is just throwing his weight around because he's a Fed. Vaughn didn't yell. He simply walked over to Hargrove, stopping so close that the disgraced officer had to look up. My mother has saved more lives in the ER of Mercy General than you have ever interacted with in your entire miserable career. You saw an easy target to bully. You picked the wrong woman, and you picked the wrong family. Your career is over. By the time I'm done, you won't even be able to get a job as a mall security guard. The sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of Mercy General Hospital were usually a place of controlled chaos. But when the double doors of the trauma bay banged open and Elara Kingston was wheeled in, the entire emergency department ground to a devastating halt. Dr. Quentin Hale, the chief of emergency medicine and a man who had trained directly under Elara during his residency, froze mid-sentence. He looked at the bruised, bloody, and frail woman strapped to the backboard. Elara, Dr. Hale whispered, the color draining from his face. Vaughn walked right behind the stretcher, his badge still clipped to his belt, his suit stained with his mother's blood and the dirt from her garden. She was assaulted by 2 Oak Ridge patrol officers. Her left shoulder is dislocated, possible rotator cuff tear, severe abrasions, and extreme hypertension from the trauma. The shock in the ER instantly transmuted into a fierce, protective outrage. Nurses who had shared break room coffees and grueling 12-hour shifts with Elara sprang into action with terrifying efficiency. They didn't just see a patient. They saw their mentor, their friend, and their family. As Dr. Hale gently reduced Elara's shoulder, a procedure that caused her to pass out briefly from the pain, Vaughn stood in the corner of the trauma bay, his phone pressed firmly to his ear. He was speaking to Desmond Quill, the special agent in charge of the regional FBI field office. I want a full workup on Officer Blaine Hargrove and Officer Declan Voss, Vaughn said, staring through the glass doors at the team working on his mother. I want their entire service jackets, every use of force complaint, every disciplinary action, every citizen grievance that local internal affairs tried to sweep under the rug. I want it on my desk by morning. You have it, Vaughn. SAC Quill replied, his voice deadly serious over the secure line. I'm dispatching an evidence response team to the precinct to secure the body cam footage before they accidentally lose the data. What about the 911 caller? Vaughn's eyes narrowed. He looked out the hospital window, picturing the massive, hyper-modern house across the street from his mother's property. Pull the dispatch audio. I want the names of the neighbors who made that call. They set the match to the powder keg. They need to be investigated for misuse of the 911 system and filing a false police report. By midnight, the wheels of a massive, unrelenting federal machine were turning at full speed. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was suffocating. Captain Finch sat in his office, his head buried in his hands. On his desk sat the preliminary background check the FBI had already forcefully requested. Officer Blaine Hargrove was not a good cop. He had 6 prior complaints for excessive force, mostly against minorities, all of which had been buried by a corrupt union representative. But the union couldn't protect him from the FBI. Meanwhile, in the affluent, quiet neighborhood of Oak Ridge, Preston and Mallory Whitaker were sitting in their designer living room, sipping expensive Pinot Noir. They were the new owners of the modern house across from Elara. They had watched the entire brutal arrest from behind their custom blinds, feeling a smug sense of satisfaction that the riffraff was being cleared from their elite neighborhood. Their satisfaction was violently interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic pounding on their front door. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor. It was the heavy, commanding strike of law enforcement. Preston Whitaker frowned, setting his wineglass down on the marble coffee table. Who on earth is that at this hour? He opened the front door, expecting to see a local patrolman following up on their call. Instead, he found himself staring at three men in the dark suits, their FBI windbreakers visible in the porch light. Preston Whitaker? The lead agent asked, his voice devoid of any warmth. Yes, can I help you? Preston asked, his arrogant posture faltering slightly. We are here regarding the 911 call you placed this afternoon at approximately 3:14 p.m., the agent stated, holding up a digital recorder. You reported a suspected burglar, a dangerous prowler. You explicitly stated you feared for your property and safety. Well, yes, Mallory Whitaker said, stepping up behind her husband, wrapping her expensive cardigan tighter around herself. There was a woman lurking around the house across the street. We didn't recognize her. We were just doing our civic duty. The agent didn't smile. The woman you reported is Elara Kingston. She has owned that property for 35 years. Because of your fabricated narrative, she is currently in the intensive care unit with severe orthopedic injuries. Preston scoffed nervously. Look, we didn't tell the cops to beat her up. We just made a phone call. We made a mistake. It's not our fault they overreacted. Filing a false police report that leads to grievous bodily harm is a felony, Mr. Whitaker, the agent countered, stepping fully into the doorway, invading Preston's space. Furthermore, if our investigation proves your call was racially motivated, you will be facing federal hate crime enhancements. We are seizing your cell phones and your home security footage. Do not leave the state. The Whitakers' faces went completely white. The insulated, privileged bubble they lived in had just been shattered by the catastrophic consequences of their own prejudice. The karma they had unleashed upon an innocent woman had officially turned its terrifying gaze directly back onto them. News of the brutal assault did not stay contained within the quiet, affluent borders of Oak Ridge. Within 48 hours, the incident transformed from a horrific local injustice into a massive national firestorm, entirely engineered by the relentless, calculating precision of Supervisory Special Agent Vaughn Kingston. He knew exactly how local police departments operated when their own were caught crossing the line. He knew the playbook: suspend the officers with pay, drag out the internal investigation until the public lost interest, and quietly reinstate them. Vaughn was absolutely determined to burn that playbook to ashes. Monday morning brought an unprecedented shock to the local precinct. Before the sun had fully risen, 3 matte black FBI command vehicles surrounded the station. Special Agent in Charge Desmond Quill, flanked by a dozen heavily armed federal agents wearing tactical gear, bypassed the front desk entirely and marched directly into Captain Harlan Finch's office. They did not come with polite requests. They came with sweeping federal subpoenas signed by a district court judge. Blaine Hargrove sat in a cramped interrogation room, stripped of his badge, his gun, and his arrogant swagger. Across from him sat his union representative Ronan Delaney, a notoriously aggressive fixer who had spent his career burying police misconduct. Delaney leaned back, chewing on a toothpick, attempting to project confidence. "Don't say a word, Blaine," Delaney muttered, looking at the mirrored glass of the interrogation room. "They're just flexing their federal muscle. We claim qualified immunity. We say the suspect was non-compliant. You feared for your safety and the injuries were incidental to a lawful arrest. It's standard. The union will back you completely. Before Hargrove could nod, the heavy metal door swung open with a terrifying crash. Vaughn Kingston walked in. He wasn't wearing his standard tailored suit. Today he wore a dark FBI tactical windbreaker, his posture radiating an icy, lethal calm. He was accompanied by Assistant United States Attorney Nadia Voss, a woman known within the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division for her ruthless prosecution of corrupt officials. "Mr. Delaney," Nadia said, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. "You can take your qualified immunity defense and throw it in the trash. We aren't here to negotiate a suspension. We are here to inform your client of the charges." "No." Nadia dropped a massive 3-inch thick binder onto the metal table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the small room. "Officer Hargrove," Vaughn said, leaning over the table, his dark eyes locking onto the trembling man. "Did you really think I was just going to look at yesterday's assault? When you decided to break my mother's body, you invited me to look into your entire life, and what I found was absolutely pathetic." Vaughn flipped open the binder. Inside were dozens of high-resolution photographs, bank statements, and witness affidavits. "For the last 8 years," Vaughn continued, his voice dangerously quiet, "you have been targeting minority drivers passing through Oak Ridge. You pull them over on fabricated traffic violations, perform illegal searches under the guise of probable cause, and you confiscate cash, claiming it's suspected drug money. But you never logged that cash into the precinct's evidence room, did you, Blaine? You pocketed it." Hargrove's face completely drained of blood. He looked at Delaney, desperate for a lifeline, but the union representative had suddenly gone incredibly still, staring at the documents. "We executed a federal search warrant on your property at 4 a.m. this morning," Nadia added smoothly, adjusting her glasses. "We found over $200,000 in unmarked cash hidden inside the drywall of your garage. We also found stolen jewelry, undeclared firearms, and 3 burner phones. You aren't just a brutal racist cop, Mr. Hargrove. You are a thief and an extortionist operating under the color of law." The trap had spectacularly, violently slammed shut. Hargrove opened his mouth to speak, a pathetic, high-pitched stammer escaping his lips, but Vaughn silenced him by holding up a single finger. "Your partner, Declan Voss, is currently sitting in the room next door," Vaughn revealed, delivering the final crushing blow. He took one look at the federal charges carrying a mandatory 20-year minimum, and he broke in less than 10 minutes. Voss signed a full proffer agreement. "He has testified to everything, Blaine. Every illegal search, every stolen dollar. And he gave a minute-by-minute breakdown of how you maliciously assaulted Elara Kingston without a shred of legal justification." Delaney stood up, grabbing his briefcase. He looked down at Hargrove with sheer disgust. "The union does not cover federal racketeering and grand larceny. You are on your own, Blaine." As Delaney walked out, leaving Hargrove completely defenseless and hyperventilating, the true scale of the karma he had invited began to crush him. He was formally indicted by the Department of Justice on 14 federal counts, including deprivation of rights under color of law, obstruction of justice, and federal racketeering. Simultaneously, a completely different, yet equally devastating brand of justice was tearing through the lives of the new neighbors across the street from 442 Sycamore Lane. Preston and Mallory Whitaker had spent their Monday morning desperately trying to hire a high-priced defense attorney. The FBI visit the previous night had shattered their reality. They thought they could simply throw money at the problem and make it disappear, completely failing to understand the gravity of a federal false reporting charge. At 10 a.m., Preston's phone rang. It was the CEO of his massive financial firm, Sterling Harlan. Preston answered, expecting to discuss a quarterly marketing report. Preston. Sterling's voice was cold, completely devoid of its usual fraternal warmth. I just received a phone call from the regional director of the FBI. Additionally, the local news station has somehow acquired the 911 dispatch audio from yesterday afternoon. They are playing it on a continuous loop. Preston felt a cold sweat break out across his back. Sterling, please. It's a complete misunderstanding. It's being blown entirely out of proportion. You called the police on a 72-year-old black woman who was gardening on her own property, Sterling said, his voice rising in anger. You told dispatch she looked dangerous and was casing the house. Because of your malicious, bigoted assumptions, that woman is in the ICU with shattered bones. Our firm manages the retirement portfolios for Mercy General Hospital. The hospital board just called me to say they will pull a $400 million account if you are still employed here by noon. You can't fire me over a personal matter, Preston yelled, his entitlement blinding him to his reality. I already did, Sterling snapped. Security is packing your desk. If you step foot on corporate property, you will be arrested for trespassing. Goodbye, Preston. Mallory Whitaker fared no better. An influential interior designer catering to the ultra-wealthy elite of the county. Her client list evaporated in a matter of hours. The moment the news broke, her affluent clients, terrified of the public relations nightmare of being associated with the woman who sparked a racially motivated police brutality incident, canceled their contracts. By Tuesday evening, the Whitakers were not only facing federal charges for misuse of emergency services and filing false reports, but they were also entirely financially ruined, trapped in a multi-million-dollar mortgage they could no longer afford. 14 grueling, highly publicized months had passed since the violent disruption of a quiet Sunday afternoon on Sycamore Lane. The towering, imposing mahogany doors of the United States Federal Courthouse swung open, groaning under their own immense weight. The air inside the sprawling, wood-paneled courtroom of the Honorable Chief Judge Miriam Locke was practically vibrating with a suffocating heavy tension. The gallery was packed to absolute capacity, a sea of anxious faces reflecting the profound impact of the case. Dozens of nurses, doctors, and orderlies from Mercy General Hospital had organized their shifts to attend, sitting shoulder to shoulder in their scrubs to form a silent, immovable wall of solidarity. Interspersed among them were community members from Oak Ridge, civil rights advocates, and a swarm of national press reporters, all gathered to witness the final, crushing conclusion of a saga that had shaken the entire state to its core. At the very front row of the gallery, completely separated from the chaotic hum of the crowd, sat Elara Kingston. Her posture was impeccably straight, a physical manifestation of her unshakable spirit despite the lingering, visible toll the assault had taken on her aging body. She wore a beautifully tailored deep purple dress, a color historically symbolizing justice, dignity, and quiet resilience. Her left arm, permanently weakened and plagued by chronic nerve damage from the violent dislocation, rested carefully on a small padded cushion in her lap. Beside her sat her son, Supervisory Special Agent Vaughn Kingston. He looked razor-sharp in his dark charcoal suit, his broad shoulders squared, his presence acting as a silent, terrifying anchor for his mother. He did not blink. His eyes remained locked on the defense table. Sitting at that table was Blaine Hargrove, the arrogant, aggressive patrolman who had strutted across the driveway of 442 Sycamore Lane, was entirely, permanently gone. In his place sat a hollowed-out, pale and violently trembling man, completely swallowed by an oversized orange federal prison jumpsuit. Denied bail due to his desperate, clumsy attempts to intimidate witnesses early in the federal investigation, Hargrove had spent the last year in a maximum security federal holding facility. Stripped of his badge, his weapon, his corrupt union protection, and his inflated sense of supremacy, he had been forced into the terrifying reality of his own microscopic insignificance. He had aged a decade in a matter of months, his hair thinning, his face drawn and sunken. Assistant United States Attorney Nadia Voss stood at the podium to deliver her closing argument before sentencing. It was nothing short of a surgical, devastating dismantling of Hargrove's entire existence. She dimmed the courtroom lights and, with a heavy keystroke, played the newly unsealed, unedited dash cam and body cam audio. The courtroom was forced to listen in horrifying, agonizing silence as Elara's desperate, polite pleas echoed through the speakers, instantly followed by the sickening, wet pop of her shoulder being wrenched from its socket and her resulting harrowing screams of pure agony. Several nurses in the gallery openly wept. Vaughn's jaw clenched so tightly the muscles ticked visibly under his skin, but he kept his arm firmly wrapped around his mother's shoulders. The defendant, Blaine Hargrove, did not act out of a fleeting moment of panic, nor did he act out of a misguided desire to protect the community, Nadia declared, her voice ringing out like a judge's gavel as she turned her piercing, furious gaze directly onto the broken man. He acted out of a grotesque, deeply ingrained sense of supremacy and unchecked malice. He viewed Elara Kingston, a retired trauma nurse, a homeowner, a grandmother, not as a citizen to be protected, but as an object to be broken simply because she dared to exist in a space he believed she did not belong. He built an entire career on terrorizing the vulnerable, stealing from the marginalized, and hiding behind a piece of metal on his chest. But he vastly underestimated the formidable strength of the woman he attacked, and he completely failed to account for the unwavering, absolute reach of federal justice. When Judge Locke finally called Hargrove to stand for sentencing, the courtroom held its collective breath. The silence was absolute. Blaine Hargrove, Judge Locke spoke, her voice echoing down from the bench with profound, inescapable authority. You took a sacred oath to protect the vulnerable. Instead, you weaponized your state-sanctioned authority to terrorize them for your own financial gain and twisted gratification. You are a disgrace to the uniform, a severe danger to a free society, and above all else, a coward. For the charges of deprivation of civil rights resulting in severe bodily injury, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of federal racketeering, I sentence you to 240 months, 20 full years, in a federal penitentiary. This sentence will be served without the possibility of parole. A massive collective sigh of relief washed over the gallery, but Dr. Quentin Hale, sitting a few rows back, bowed his head, letting out a long, shaky breath. Hargrove's knees completely gave out. He slumped forward, sobbing uncontrollably, putting his head on the defense table as federal marshals moved in to physically drag him away to his new permanent reality. However, the scales of justice did not stop balancing at the criminal trial. Famed civil rights attorney Tobias Grant, working in seamless tandem with the Kingston family, had filed a catastrophic, meticulously documented civil lawsuit against the Oak Ridge Police Department and the county municipality. Recognizing they had absolutely no viable legal defense against the overwhelming mountain of federal evidence Vaughn had compiled, the city council panicked. Terrified of a prolonged public trial that would decimate their budget, they authorized a historic, unprecedented $35 million settlement before the case ever even reached the discovery phase. Elara Kingston, a woman who had spent her entire 72 years serving others, flatly refused to keep the massive fortune for herself. Aside from securing enough funds to cover her extensive ongoing physical therapy and medical bills, she took the entirety of the settlement and established the Kingston Foundation for Justice and Health Care. Within 6 months, the foundation was fully operational, funding full-ride medical scholarships for underprivileged minority students who lacked the resources to pursue their dreams. Furthermore, she broke ground on a state-of-the-art free community, health and urgent care clinic in the poorest, most neglected district of the county, ensuring that nobody would be denied care because of their zip code. As for Preston and Mallory Whitaker, the arrogant neighbors who had lit the match that sparked the entire inferno, their karma was absolute, humiliating, and permanent. Facing imminent personal bankruptcy, federal probation for filing false reports, and the crushing, suffocating weight of astronomical legal fees, their fabricated world of elite privilege completely collapsed. Forced to sell their hyper-modern monstrosity of a house at a devastating financial loss just to pay their lawyers, they became complete pariahs. No country club would accept them. No local business would hire them. One crisp, foggy morning at 3 a.m., desperate to avoid the glaring lenses of local paparazzi and the scornful eyes of the neighborhood, they loaded whatever belongings they had left into a rented moving truck. They fled the state in the dead of night, relocating to a cramped, dilapidated 2-bedroom apartment in a distant, unforgiving city. Their reputations forever destroyed by a single 2-minute phone call fueled by prejudice and entitlement. Time pushed forward, and spring eventually returned to Sycamore Lane. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden, forgiving glow across the manicured lawns and sweeping oak trees. Elara Kingston knelt in the rich, dark soil of her front yard. She wore her familiar faded canvas apron and her wide-brimmed gardening hat. Her movements were noticeably slower now, much more deliberate, and she relied heavily on a specialized padded gardening stool to ease the pressure on her reconstructed hip. But the beautiful, vibrant heirloom roses were blooming more spectacularly than ever under her loving care. She wasn't alone. The neighborhood of Oak Ridge had fundamentally, beautifully changed. The massive, imposing privacy fences remained, but the invisible walls of apathy and isolation between the residents had shattered completely. The brutal incident had forced the entire community to look in the mirror and decide what kind of people they wanted to be. Neighbors who had lived on the street for a decade without saying a single word now regularly stopped by to check on her. A young family who had recently moved in 2 doors down was currently helping Elara lay down fresh, fragrant cedar mulch. Their 2 young children laughed joyously as they chased yellow butterflies through the expansive flower beds. The low, familiar rumble of an engine caught Elara's attention. Supervisory Special Agent Vaughn Kingston pulled his sleek, government-issued black Suburban into the driveway, parking carefully so as not to block the newly planted hydrangeas. He cut the engine. A gentle, genuine, and deeply relaxed smile spreading across his face as he watched his mother direct her new neighbor on the exact, proper angle to prune a stubborn, thorny stem. He stepped out of the heavy vehicle, unbuttoning his tailored suit jacket, the warm spring breeze catching his tie. The heavy, dark weight of his relentless job, hunting the worst of humanity, still rested on his broad shoulders. But standing here on this quiet suburban street, the world felt profoundly, unequivocally right. The driveway was no longer a site of trauma. It was just a driveway again. "Mom?" Vaughn called out warmly, leaning casually against the sturdy hood of his truck. "I brought the pot roast." Elara turned slowly, pushing her wire-rimmed glasses up her nose with an earth-stained glove, Her face lit up with a brilliant, unstoppable, radiant joy. The thin, white scars from the assault were still faintly visible on her cheek, a quiet, permanent testament to the horrific trauma she had survived, but her eyes held absolutely no fear, only profound peace. Well, don't just stand there in that expensive suit, baby. You'll get it dirty. Elara laughed, her voice ringing out like a clear, sweet bell over the tranquil neighborhood, mingling with the sound of the children playing. Bring it inside. The table is already set, and I made extra for the folks next door. Justice had not just been served, it had fundamentally rewritten the fabric of their world. The darkness of corruption, arrogance, and prejudice had violently attempted to uproot Elara Kingston, assuming she was weak. But they had completely, catastrophically failed to realize how incredibly deep her roots were planted and exactly how fiercely her bloodline would fight to protect the sacred ground she stood on. The horrifying assault on Elara Kingston is a chilling reminder of how unchecked prejudice and abuse of power can shatter innocent lives in seconds. But it also stands as a powerful testament to the unstoppable force of true justice when karma finally comes calling. Supervisory Special Agent Vaughn Kingston proved that no badge, no wealth, and no corrupt system can protect abusers when the truth is dragged into the light. From the devastating downfall of Officer Blaine Hargrove to the utter financial ruin of the neighbors who started it all, this story proves that actions always have consequences. If you felt the incredible impact of this story and loved watching absolute justice dismantle corruption, hit that like button. Share this video to remind the world that nobody is above the law. And make sure to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life stories of instant karma and righteous retribution.